I knew I shouldn't have been there the moment I stepped into the ballroom and realized I didn't recognize a single face that felt like home. The room was full, easily 70 people, maybe more, dressed in a kind of polished confidence I had spent most of my life learning to stay quiet around. Crystal chandeliers reflected off champagne glasses. Soft jazz floated over conversations that sounded practiced, rehearsed. This wasn't just a party. It was a performance. And I wasn't part of the cast. My name is Claire Hale. I'm 31. And that night, I was standing in a navy dress that didn't quite fit the room, holding a small gift bag I almost left in my car. The invitation had come from my mother, Margaret Hale, with one line, "It would mean a lot if you showed up." She didn't say for who. Across the room, I saw my father, Franklin Hale, holding court near the bar. He had that same posture I remembered from board meetings, shoulders back, voice low, always just loud enough for people to lean in. Around him stood donors, local business leaders, and a few familiar faces from Hale Harbor's board. They laughed at the right moments. They always did. And then there was my brother. Owen Hale stood near the center of the room, glass in hand, absorbing attention like it belonged to him. Tonight was technically his celebration, a milestone tied to the expansion of Hale Harbor, the senior living company my grandmother built, and my father turned into something much bigger. Owen had stepped into a leadership role months ago, and from the outside, it looked like everything was working exactly the way it was supposed to. From the outside, I stayed near the far wall, close enough to be seen if someone looked, far enough to be forgotten if they didn't. For a few minutes, that worked, until Owen noticed me. "Claire," he said, lifting his glass slightly, his tone light but sharp enough to cut through the noise. "Didn't think you'd make it." A few heads turned. Conversation softened just enough. "I almost didn't," I said. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Still not a fan of how we do things." I tilted my head. "Depends what you mean by we." It was quiet, subtle, but something shifted. I didn't see my father move. I felt him. His hand closed around my arm before I could take a step back. "What did you just say?" Franklin asked, his voice low, controlled in the way that always meant something worse was coming. I said. The slap came fast, sharp, clean, loud enough to break the room in half. For a second, no one moved. Then his other hand was in my hair. He didn't hesitate. He pulled hard, dragging me backward, like I weighed nothing, like I was something to be removed, not someone to be heard. My heels slipped against the polished floor, my balance gone before I could catch it. I heard a laugh, soft, familiar, my mother, and then something else, a single clap. "Owen, you had it coming," he said, almost casually, like he was confirming something everyone else already believed. No one stepped forward. Not one person reached for me. They watched. My father dragged me through the room and toward the doors, past people who avoided my eyes, past the same faces that had smiled at him minutes earlier. Outside, the night air hit cold and immediate. He let go. I stumbled forward, catching myself against a stone column, my scalp burning where his fingers had twisted into my hair. For a moment, I just stood there breathing, feeling the sting spread across my cheek. Then I straightened. I didn't go back inside. I walked across the parking lot, the sound of my heels sharp against the concrete, steady, even though my hands weren't. When I reached my car, I didn't sit right away. I stood there, one hand on the door, looking at my reflection in the dark window. Same face, different line crossed. I got in, closed the door, and reached for my phone. I didn't scroll. I already knew the name. Arthur Bell. My thumb hovered for a second. Not because I didn't know what I was doing, but because I understood exactly what it meant. Then I pressed call. I didn't drive home right away. For a while, I just sat in the car with the engine off, the silence, pressing in where the noise of the ballroom had been. My cheek still stung, but it wasn't the pain that stayed with me. It was the way no one had moved. Not one person. I'd spent years convincing myself that what happened inside our family was complicated, that it had context, that if I just understood it better, I could find a place where it made sense. But there was nothing complicated about what I had just walked out of. It was simple. They knew, and they were fine with it. I finally started the car and pulled out of the lot, headlights cutting through the quiet streets of Worthington. It was late, but not late enough for the world to feel asleep. A few cars passed. A porch light flicked on as I drove by. Life going on ordinary and steady, like nothing had shifted. But something had. It wasn't just tonight. Tonight had just made it impossible to ignore. Growing up, there was always a version of the story that made everything seem reasonable. My father worked hard. My mother kept things together. My brother excelled. And me, I was the one who did things differently. That's how they said it. When I was 10, I remember bringing home a report card with all A's, except for one B in math. My father looked at it, nodded once, and asked why I wasn't pushing myself harder. Owen had a science fair ribbon that year. That's what we talked about at dinner. When I was 17, I got into a state university on a partial scholarship. I was proud of it. My mother smiled, hugged me, and then spent the rest of the evening calling relatives to tell them Owen had been selected for a leadership program tied to the company. There was always a way to shift the focus, always a way to make me feel like I was almost enough, but not quite where I needed to be. I told myself it was normal. Families compare, families prioritize. That's just how things work. But Hale Harbor changed that. Or maybe it revealed what had always been there. My grandmother had built Hale Harbor from nothing. A small single-building care home with a waiting list because people trusted her. She knew every resident by name. She showed up early. She stayed late. She believed that dignity wasn't something you advertised. It was something you practiced. After she passed, my father took over. Franklin Hale didn't dismantle what she built. He polished it, expanded it, rebranded it. The facilities got bigger. The events got better. The donors got richer. And the story got cleaner. Owen fit into that world easily. He always had. He knew how to talk to people, how to make them feel like they were part of something important. When he stepped into a leadership role, no one questioned it. It looked right. I was the one who didn't fit the picture. I handled compliance for a while. Internal reports, documentation, things no one ever talked about at events like the one tonight. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. At least it mattered to me. There were small things at first. Reports that came back with edits I didn't make. Numbers adjusted just enough to avoid follow-up questions. Notes from staff that disappeared between drafts. I asked about it. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to understand. The answers were always smooth. There's context you're not seeing. We're handling it. You don't need to worry about that level of detail. I wanted to believe them. For a long time I did, until I couldn't anymore. 3 months ago, I walked away from Hale Harbor. My father called it a mistake. My brother called it predictable. My mother said I was overreacting, and that I'd regret making things harder than they needed to be. No one asked why I left. Not really. I pulled into my apartment parking lot and turned off the engine. The dashboard lights faded, leaving me in the dark again. My phone was still in my hand. Arthur Bell's name sat at the top of my call history now. He hadn't been part of our family, not exactly, but he'd known my grandmother. He'd been around long enough to understand what Hale Harbor used to be, and maybe what it had become. I leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes for a second. Tonight wasn't the beginning. It was the moment everything lined up in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. I opened my eyes and looked down at my phone again. For the first time, I wasn't asking myself if I was overreacting. I was asking something else. How far had this really gone? And how much of it had I already seen without letting myself name it? I didn't turn on the overhead lights when I walked into my apartment. The lamp beside the couch was enough. Soft. Contained. It kept the room from feeling too honest. I set the gift bag on the counter without opening it, kicked off my heels, and went straight to the bathroom. My cheek had started to darken along the bone. Not dramatic yet, but enough to change my face. I pulled my hair over one shoulder and saw the reddened patch near my scalp, where my father's hand had twisted hard enough to leave heat behind. I rinsed my face, pressed a cold washcloth to my skin, and looked at myself in the mirror. For years, I had been good at separating what hurt from what mattered. Tonight, for the first time, those two things felt like they might be connected. I carried the washcloth with me into the living room, set it down, and pulled my old work laptop from the bottom shelf of my bookcase. I had kept it after I left Hale Harbor because it held personal notes, archived drafts, and a few compliance templates I had built myself. Nothing confidential, I'd told myself at the time. Nothing that would matter, but I knew my own habits. When I couldn't make sense of something at work, I documented it. Quietly, thoroughly. Not because I planned to use it, because I needed proof that I wasn't imagining what I was seeing. The laptop took too long to wake up. While it loaded, I opened the drawer of my side table and pulled out a slim navy folder I hadn't touched in months. Inside were printouts I had carried home one page at a time, usually because I told myself I wanted to review them later. Incident summaries, expense drafts, staffing notes, things that never belonged in the same folder, and yet somehow did. I opened an old spreadsheet first. At a glance, it looked harmless. Event allocations, vendor reimbursements, community outreach costs, the kind of polished language Hale Harbor used whenever money needed to sound generous. But one line near the bottom caught my eye. Resident Emergency Reserve Transfer. I stared at it longer than I meant to. Then I opened another file, a budget packet from 6 months earlier. Same phrase, different amount, different date. I clicked into a third document, then a fourth. The wording shifted slightly each time, but the pattern held. Small transfers, quiet ones, never large enough to look dramatic on their own. I pulled one of the printouts from the folder and matched the dates. A donor dinner, a facility tour for major backers, a private planning retreat tied to the expansion Owen had celebrated tonight. I leaned back, slowly, my stomach tightening in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. Not proof, not yet, but not nothing. I kept going. The staffing reports were worse, not in scale, in shape. I found a draft with handwritten notes from a night supervisor at the Westerville property, 2 aides short, 1 resident, fall, delayed response, because the floor was understaffed. In the final version, saved to the system, the wording had changed. No staffing shortage, no delay. The fall was described as an isolated event, properly handled. I remembered asking about that report. I remembered Owen telling me not to get buried in floor-level noise when the company was trying to move forward. At the time, I told myself he was arrogant. Now I wasn't sure that was the whole story. My phone buzzed on the cushion beside me. Arthur Bell. It wasn't a call this time, just a message. Bring everything you have. 7:30 tomorrow morning. My office. Do not email it. I looked down at the folder in my lap, then back at the laptop screen. For months, I had been asking whether something was off. Tonight I finally had a harder question. What if the slap wasn't the scandal? What if it was just the first thing they'd done in public? Arthur Bell's office sat on the second floor of an old brick building just off High Street, the kind of place that still had brass directory plates and a front door heavy enough to remind you that important things took effort. I got there 10 minutes early. The bruise along my cheek had deepened overnight, and I had pulled my hair low to cover the tender spot near my scalp. I carried the navy folder from my apartment, pressed against my ribs, along with my old laptop in a worn canvas tote. Neither felt heavy until I reached for the handle and realized my hand was shaking. Arthur opened the door before I could knock a second time. He had to be in his early 70s now. Tall, careful in the way older men sometimes are when they've spent enough years being listened to. He'd served as probate judge before retiring, and after that he stayed close to Hale Harbor because of my grandmother. He had been one of the few people she trusted to tell her the truth without softening it. When his eyes landed on my face, his expression changed. He didn't ask what happened. He stepped aside and said, "Come in." The office smelled faintly like old paper and coffee. Legal books lined one wall, and a small framed photograph of my grandmother sat near the window beside a potted plant that had seen better days. That picture caught me off guard more than anything else in the room. She was younger there than I ever knew her, smiling in front of the original Hale Harbor building, with her sleeves rolled up and sunlight on her face. Arthur noticed me looking. She hated ribbon cuttings, he said quietly. Loved opening day. Hated ceremonies. I almost smiled, but it didn't stay. A woman I hadn't met before stood near the conference table tablet, in one hand, yellow legal pad in the other. She was probably in her 40s, dark suit, no wasted movement. The kind of face that didn't reveal thought before it had somewhere useful to go. "This is Marisol Trent," Arthur said. "Outside counsel. She handles governance and regulatory matters." Marisol offered her hand. "Claire." That was all. No softness, no performance. And for some reason, that steadied me more than sympathy would have. We sat. I laid out the folder, then the laptop, then the printed incident summaries and budget pages I had matched up in my apartment. I expected to start at the party. Instead, Arthur looked at the bruise on my cheek and said, "Begin there." So I did. I told them about the ballroom, the guests. Owen's smile, my mother's laugh, the slap, the hair, the doors, the parking lot. I told it straight, the way I would have documented a workplace incident if it had happened to someone else. Time, location, witnesses, sequence. Marisol took notes without interrupting. Only when I finished did she ask, "Was there visible camera coverage in the room?" "Yes," I said. "At least 2. One near the entrance, one by the bar." She nodded once. "Good." Arthur's jaw tightened. I never thought Franklin would be stupid in public. The word landed harder than outrage would have. Public. Because that was the shift, wasn't it? Not that my father had crossed a line. That he had crossed one in front of people who mattered. Then I showed them the documents. Not everything made sense yet, and I said that plainly. I pointed to the repeated line items tied to resident emergency reserves, the expense language that changed from one packet to another, the altered staffing reports from Westerville, the missing details, the timing around donor events and expansion planning. Arthur leaned forward slowly, his reading glasses low on his nose. Marisol asked for dates versions, where each page came from, whether the drafts were mine, whether I had ever raised concerns internally. "Yes," I said, "more than once." "With who?" "My father. Owen. Sometimes finance." And what happened? They told me I was getting lost in details. Marisol wrote that down. For a moment, no one spoke. The office felt too still, the kind of stillness that comes right before a storm decides which direction it's going. Then Marisol turned the legal pad toward herself and said almost to the room, "We preserve first. No emails, no calls to the company, no warnings." Arthur looked at me. "Claire, from this point forward, you assume anything inside Hale Harbor can disappear if someone gets nervous." I felt that sentence all the way down to my hands. Not because it surprised me, because it fit. Marisol started listing steps in a voice so calm it made everything sound more serious, not less. Board notice, preservation demand, temporary lock on internal destruction authority, quiet collection of surveillance footage from the event venue before anyone could claim routine overwrite, review of restricted fund movement, verification of incident reporting versions. None of it sounded dramatic. That was what made it frightening. This wasn't revenge. Not yet. It was process. And process had a way of becoming real before people noticed they'd lost control of it. Arthur folded his hands and looked at the photograph of my grandmother for a long second before turning back to me. "If these records hold," he said, "last night may not be the worst thing Franklin did. It may just be the thing that forced everything else into daylight." I looked down at the Navy folder in front of me. The bruise on my face was still warm under my makeup. The room was quiet. Outside the window, traffic moved like any other weekday morning. But something had already shifted. By the time I left Arthur Bell's office, I understood one thing clearly. I wasn't walking back into a family argument. I was walking into a system that had finally been told to stop looking away. By late Wednesday afternoon, the bruise on my cheek had stopped throbbing and started doing something worse. It had settled in. That was the thing about damage, once it chose to stay. It no longer felt like an event. It felt like a fact. Marisol had told me to go home, keep my phone close, and say nothing to anyone connected to Hale Harbor unless she approved it first. Arthur had promised the board notice would go out before the close of business. On paper, that should have made me feel safer. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with the Navy folder open and the old laptop humming beside it, waiting for the next proof of what I already knew in my bones. It came just after 4. The knock was measured, not hesitant, not aggressive. When I opened the door, I found a broad-shouldered man in a weathered field jacket, holding a cardboard file box against one hip. "Claire Hale?" he asked. I nodded. "Rick Delano. Arthur said you'd know I was coming." I stepped aside. Rick looked like the kind of man people trusted to notice what other people missed. Late 60s, close-cropped gray hair, eyes that moved before the rest of him did. Arthur had mentioned him once or twice over the years, a former police detective who now handled quiet, investigative work for attorneys, insurers, and boards when situations turned sensitive. He set the box on my table and opened it without ceremony. "I pulled what Arthur was authorized to request quickly," he said. "Nothing flashy, just enough to tell us whether the smoke has a source." Inside were copies of event contracts, reimbursement summaries, internal calendar, printouts, and 3 envelopes clipped together with a yellow tab. I sat down slowly. Rick pulled the first envelope free. Ballroom venue confirmed they preserved security footage from the main room and service corridor. No release yet, but it's there. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. He slid the second envelope toward me. "These are transfer logs tied to restricted accounts. Not full bank discovery. Just internal movement records from financial packets the board should have reviewed." I opened it. The same language I had seen the night before stared back at me. Except now, it sat beside initials, approval markers, and coding notes that made it harder to dismiss as clerical noise. Resident Emergency Reserve, Temporary Reallocation, Executive Hospitality Support, Advancement Event Costs. The words didn't shout. They didn't need to. Rick tapped the page with one blunt finger. "See that code? Same one shows up on the donor anniversary dinner, the expansion retreat, and a vendor payment for last weekend's party." "My father's party," I said. Rick's mouth tightened. That would be the one. I turned another page and saw a notation attached to a transfer request. OH approval. For a second, I just looked at it. Owen Hale. Not vague, not implied, not family lore or instinct. A mark, a trail, a hand on paper. Rick didn't push. He let the silence do what it needed to do. Then he opened the third envelope. "These are staffing versions from Westerville," he said. "Draft and final. You were right." The language was cleaned. I laid the pages side by side. In one version, 2 aides, short delayed response, resident fall. In the other, isolated incident, resolved appropriately, no operational concern. Same date, same property, same event, different truth. Not misunderstanding, not pressure. Choice. I felt something in me go still. Not calmer, clearer. For years I had treated every warning sign like a loose thread. Something to note, something to revisit, something that might make sense once I had more context. But context wasn't coming to save this. My father had raised his hand in public because he believed the room would protect him. My brother had smiled because he believed the numbers would never speak. They were both wrong. Rick closed the box and looked at me across the table. "You still have a chance to walk away from the noise," he said, "but not from what's in front of you." I looked down at the bruised, dark reflection in the black laptop screen, then at Owen's initials on the page. When I spoke, my voice was quieter than I expected. I'm done helping them sound respectable, and once I said it, I knew I wouldn't take it back. By Thursday morning, the silence around Hale Harbor didn't feel like calm. It felt like containment. No one had called me from the company. Not my father, not Owen, not anyone from finance or operations. The absence wasn't accidental. It was controlled. Marisol had warned me this would happen. They won't engage until they understand what you have, she'd said the night before. And when they do, it won't sound like confrontation. It'll sound like resolution. At 9:12 a.m., my phone buzzed. My mother. I let it ring once before answering. Claire Margaret, said, her voice soft, measured the same tone she used when she wanted something to feel reasonable before it was revealed to be anything but. Your father would like to sit down. Just the three of us. No lawyers, no dramatics. I looked out the window at the quiet street below my apartment. No lawyers, I asked. This doesn't need to turn into something public, she said. It was a misunderstanding that got out of hand. There it was. Not denial. Reduction. I closed my eyes briefly. Where? Home. 2 o'clock. I didn't say yes, but I didn't say no either. When I hung up, Marisol was already calling. Let me guess, she said. Private meeting. Family tone. No counsel. Yes. Then you're not going alone, she said immediately. I need to, I answered. There was a pause on the line. Not disagreement. Calculation. Then you listen more than you speak, she said. And you don't sign anything. You don't agree to anything. If they show you paper, you bring it back to me. They will. I know, she said. The house looked exactly the same. White siding, trimmed hedges. The same stone walkway I had memorized as a kid. Nothing about it suggested that anything inside had shifted. That was the point. Margaret opened the door before I knocked. Come in, she said, stepping aside, her cardigan perfectly in place. Her expression composed enough to pass for calm. Inside, everything smelled faintly of lemon polish and something floral, clean, controlled, the kind of environment where nothing inconvenient was allowed to linger. My father was already seated in the living room. Franklin Hale didn't stand when I entered. He sat upright, hands folded, a neat stack of papers on the coffee table in front of him. Owen leaned back on the opposite side, one ankle resting on his knee, his phone in his hand, like he had somewhere better to be. No one mentioned the party. No one mentioned my face. Margaret closed the door behind me and took a seat. We all want to move forward, she said gently. My father nodded once. What happened the other night? Wasn't necessary. Owen cut in. But it's done. I looked at him, then back at the table. The papers were positioned carefully. Not hidden. Not pushed forward. Displayed. My father slid them toward me. We've prepared something to simplify this, he said. I reached for the top page. Non-disclosure agreement. Waiver of claims. A check tucked between the pages. Just enough to be seen without being acknowledged. For a moment, no one spoke. The room held itself together around the assumption that this was reasonable, that this was how problems were solved. My father watched me, his expression unreadable. You've made your concerns clear, he said. This allows everyone to step back without unnecessary damage. Unnecessary. I let the word settle. Margaret leaned forward slightly. We're still your family, Claire. Owen didn't look up from his phone. You're overcomplicating this. I turned another page. The language was precise, final, designed to close every door that had just started to open. Not an apology, a transaction. I set the papers back down, exactly where they had been. You think this fixes it? I asked. My father's jaw tightened, just enough to show it had hit something. It contains it. There it was again. Not right or wrong, contained or not. I looked at each of them one at a time. At my mother, who still believed control could pass for care. At my brother, who believed this was all beneath him. At my father, who had spent a lifetime deciding which version of reality counted. And for the first time, I understood something without needing to question it. If I took that check, I didn't just lose the case. I lost the truth. I'm not signing this, I said. The room shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. Margaret's smile faltered. Owen finally looked up. My father's expression hardened into something colder. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he said. No, I answered quietly. You did that. I stood, leaving the papers untouched. For a second, no one moved. Then, Owen exhaled sharply. You really think you can win this? I paused at the doorway, not turning back. I'm not trying to win, I said. I'm done pretending. And that was the moment I knew there was no way back. By Friday morning, the calls started. Not to me. Around me. I knew it the moment I stepped into the small cafe 2 blocks from my apartment and felt the shift in the room. Not silence. Not attention. Something more subtle. The kind of awareness that travels faster than facts. I ordered coffee, took it to the corner table, and kept my phone face down. It didn't stay quiet for long. Marisol's name lit up the screen. They've been notified, she said without preamble. Board internal counsel in a limited regulatory alert. That's where we are. Limited, I repeated. For now, she said. But that window won't hold. I looked out through the glass, watching a couple walk past their conversation, easy, uninterrupted. What happens next? They assess exposure, she said, and they decide how much they're willing to admit versus how much they think they can contain. Contain. The same word my father had used. Arthur pushed for temporary review authority, she added. There's already resistance. From who? You already know, she said. I did. Franklin Hale didn't lose control all at once. He held on to it in layers. And Owen had never needed control. He had always had protection. I need you to understand something, Marisol continued. This is where it turns. Not in a courtroom. In perception. In pressure. In who blinks first. I ended the call and sat there a moment longer than I needed to. Then my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Marisol. It was a number I hadn't seen in months. Hale Harbor. Internal. I didn't answer. The voicemail came through less than a minute later. Claire, it's Denise from Westerville, the voice said. I don't know what's happening, but people are asking questions about reports we filed last quarter. They're pulling copies I haven't seen since we submitted them. I thought you should know. Her voice dropped at the end like saying it out loud had already gone too far. I saved the message. Then I played it again. Not for the content, for the tone. It wasn't panic. It was something quieter. Relief edged with fear. By noon the second message came. This one from Arthur. Short. Direct. Emergency board session scheduled. Effective immediately. Franklin and Owen are stepping back pending review. Stepping back. Not removed. Not yet. But no longer untouchable. I stared at the message. The words sitting heavier than they looked. This was what it meant when systems stopped looking away. Not collapse. Shift. And shifts were unstable. I paid for my coffee and walked back outside, the air sharper than it had been that morning. My phone vibrated again before I reached the corner. Unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. Claire, a male voice said. Familiar, controlled. You've made your point. My father. I'm not sure you understand what you're putting at risk, he continued. This doesn't just affect me. It affects every resident, every employee, every family connected to Hale Harbor. I stopped walking. Traffic moved around me, steady, indifferent. You're right, I said. It does. There was a pause. You think you're protecting them, he said. You're not. You're destabilizing something people rely on. I looked up at the building across the street, glass, reflecting a version of me that felt further away than it should have. What I relied on, I said quietly, was the truth. Silence stretched on the other end. Then his voice came back sharper. You're making a mistake. The line went dead. I stood there for a moment longer, the phone still in my hand. For the first time since the ballroom, I felt it clearly. Not doubt, risk, not abstract, not emotional, real. People were already being pulled into this. Staff, residents, systems that didn't reset just because one person decided to speak. And my father wasn't backing down. Neither was Owen. Whatever came next wasn't going to be quiet. I turned the corner and started walking again slower, this time more deliberate. The plan I thought I had collect document handed over was already shifting under my feet. This wasn't just about exposing what they did. It was about what that exposure would do to everything around it. And for the first time, I understood something I hadn't let myself fully face before. Once this moved forward, there would be no clean version of it, only the version that held. By Monday morning, the story had split in two. There was the version built from records, timestamps, and the kind of language that made people sit straighter when they read it. Then there was the version my father preferred, cleaner, simpler, easier to repeat over coffee or behind closed office doors. A difficult daughter, a family misunderstanding, an overreaction at a stressful event, a former employee with hurt feelings and bad timing. That was the version starting to move. I saw it first in the way people stopped saying my name directly. Arthur called just after 8. His voice sounded older than it had on Friday. "They're consolidating," he said. "Franklin's counsel is pushing a reputational defense angle. They're saying the board overreacted, that internal reviews are being misread, and that operational instability is the real danger now." I leaned against my kitchen counter, staring at the mug in my hand, without drinking from it. "So this becomes about me." "It becomes about control," Arthur said. "That's not always the same thing, but it often looks like it." When the call ended, I stood in the quiet for a minute, then opened my laptop and did something I should have done sooner. I stopped reading for pain and started reading for pattern. Every message I had saved, every internal memo, every report draft, every note from meetings that had left me with the vague, sour feeling that something important had been pushed out of sight. I laid them out across my table in dated stacks, the navy folder open beside me, my coffee going cold. By noon, the room no longer looked like an apartment. It looked like a timeline, and timelines had a way of stripping charm from people who depended on confusion. The first thing I saw clearly was my own mistake. I had assumed that evidence alone would force correction, that once enough people saw enough truth, the adults in the room would behave like adults. But Franklin Hale had never built his life on truth. He had built it on sequence, on deciding what people heard first, what they heard second, and what they never got close enough to compare. Owen had learned the same lesson younger and prettier. That was why they weren't panicking in public. They were editing. Marisol arrived at 1 with 2 legal pads, a messenger bag, and the focused expression she wore when she already knew the room had been left behind by events. She looked over the papers covering my table and gave one short nod. "Good," she said. "Now it's useful." I almost laughed. "That's a bleak word?" "It's a legal word," she said, setting her bag down. "Better." She worked through the stacks with me, not asking what hurt, only what could be proven, what could be sequenced, what could be tied to whom, without giving anyone room to call it interpretation. We marked the ballroom assault separately. We marked the restricted fund transfers. We marked the altered Westerville report. Then Marisol drew a line down the center of a legal pad and wrote 2 headings. Conduct. Knowledge. She tapped the page with her pen. "This is where people like your father survive. They admit, tone, deny intent. Admit mess, deny awareness. Admit pressure, deny design." I looked at the initials on one of the transfer sheets. OH approval. Owen's hand without his hand. "So we show both," I said. Marisol met my eyes. "Exactly." For the first time since Friday, I felt something settle into place. Not peace, position. We were no longer chasing the whole truth at once. We were building the version that would hold when they tried to blur it. Arthur called again later that afternoon. The board had agreed to a formal hearing process. Temporary separation from day-to-day operations would remain in place. There was resistance from 2 board members with close donor ties, but not enough to stop review. Franklin's furious Arthur said. "That's not new," I answered. "No," he said, "but this is. Owen's asking for private access to certain records. He says he wants to prepare a statement. A statement. Not an explanation, not accountability. Narrative." When the call ended, I looked back at the table. For days, I had felt like I was being pulled into something larger than I could control. That feeling wasn't gone, but it had changed shape. I understood the battlefield now. This was never going to be won by being the most wounded person in the room. It would be won by being the clearest. By the time the daylight thinned at the window, Marisol had taken copies, flagged priorities, and left me with one instruction written in block letters across the top of a yellow page. Do not respond to noise. Build the record. I read it twice after she left. Then I closed the laptop, set my hand on the Navy folder, and let myself imagine the next step without flinching. They had spent years controlling the order in which the truth appeared. Now, that was the only thing I intended to take from them. The hearing was held on Thursday morning in a conference room that tried too hard to look neutral. Long table, gray carpet, bottled water lined up with legal pads no one touched unless they had something to protect. The kind of room where people like to pretend decisions came from procedure alone and not from fear pressure or the slow collapse of denial. I arrived with Marisol 10 minutes early. Arthur was already there at the far end of the table, reading glasses, low on his nose, a binder open in front of him. Two board members I knew only by reputation sat stiffly beside him, both dressed like they wanted distance from the mess, without giving up authority over it. At the opposite end, my father sat in a dark suit, with his own counsel hands folded, posture perfect. Owen was beside him, clean-shaven, jaw tight, trying to look composed and succeeding only from a distance. My mother wasn't there. That did not surprise me. Marisol set our files down in a neat stack and spoke in the same measured tone she had used all week. No drama, no rush. She began with the ballroom incident, not because it was the whole story, but because it established the pattern they had hoped to keep separate from everything else. The footage had been retrieved. No edits, no missing angle, no softening. My father's hand striking my face, his grip in my hair, my body pulled backward across polished floor. Guests watching. No intervention. And then Owen visible in the frame, clapping once, with that same expression I had replayed too many times in my head. No one at the table spoke while it played. After that, Marisol moved to the records. Not a flood, a sequence. Restricted resident, emergency funds. Redirected, encoded transfers. Event costs, aligned with donor dinners, executive hospitality, and last weekend's party. Draft staffing reports from Westerville showing shortages and delayed response. Final versions with the risk removed and the language cleaned. Approval markers, time stamps, internal circulation. Then the page with Owen's initials. OH approval. It wasn't dramatic to look at. It was worse than dramatic. It was ordinary. Ordinary was harder to argue with. Franklin's attorney tried to frame the transfers as temporary internal reallocations made under operational strain. Owen's role, he said, had been administrative, not strategic. The altered reports, he suggested, were standard revisions for clarity, not deception. Marisol didn't raise her voice. She just kept building the record. She laid draft beside final, date beside date, need beside expense, signature beside consequence. By the time she was done, the room no longer felt neutral. It felt witnessed. Then Arthur asked whether I wished to make a statement. I had prepared one, but when I looked down at the page in front of me, I realized I didn't want to read it. I wanted to say it, so I did. I said that for years, I had mistaken silence for stability. That I had believed if I worked hard enough, stayed careful enough, documented enough, I could avoid becoming the problem in a family that only knew how to survive by choosing one. I said the slap mattered because it was public, but the records mattered because they proved the same thing had been happening in quieter rooms for longer than anyone wanted to admit. I said Hale Harbor had been built to protect older people when they were at their most vulnerable, and that somewhere along the way, my father and brother had decided vulnerability was a resource. No one interrupted me. When I finished, one of the board members, an older woman with silver hair and a voice steady enough to quiet a room without trying, closed her folder and spoke first. This board cannot ignore what has been placed before it. The vote that followed wasn't dramatic either. It was worse for them than drama. It was official. Independent oversight would be imposed immediately. Franklin and Owen would remain barred from day-to-day operations. Key accounts tied to restricted funds would be frozen, pending full forensic review. The matter would be referred for external, regulatory, and financial investigation. No one gasped. No one slammed a hand on the table. But I watched my father's face lose something it had carried for as long as I had known him. Not confidence, assumption. Owen leaned toward his lawyer and said something too low for me to hear. For the first time, he looked young in the wrong way. Marisol closed her binder. Arthur looked at me once across the table, not with triumph, but with recognition. It was done, at least this part of it. Outside, the air was cold and bright. I stood on the steps with my coat still open, letting the wind hit my face. My father came out a minute later with Owen behind him. He didn't come close enough to make a scene. He just stopped, looked at me, and said, "You've damaged more than you understand." I met his eyes. "No," I said. I finally named it. Then I turned and walked down the steps before either of them could answer. The consequences had started. That didn't mean I felt lighter. It just meant they were no longer carrying none of the weight. The final notice came 2 weeks later on a Tuesday afternoon that felt almost too ordinary for what it carried. I was sitting at my kitchen table, the same place where the Navy folder had first spread open into something I couldn't ignore. The folder was still there now, but thinner, organized, no longer something I needed to hold together by hand. My phone buzzed once. Marisol. "It's done," she said. There was no pause, no buildup. Just that. The external investigation had been formally opened. Financial authorities had confirmed irregular use of restricted resident funds. Civil proceedings were moving forward, and criminal review had been referred based on the documentation chain. Franklin Hale had stepped down permanently from all executive roles. Owen had resigned. Their access to internal systems, accounts, and decision-making authority had been cut off entirely. There were no dramatic headlines yet, no public spectacle, but the structure they had relied on, quiet influence, controlled narratives, assumed trust, had been removed. And without that, everything else followed. "They won't be able to operate around this," Marisol added, "not in the way they did before." I thanked her, not because it felt finished, but because I understood what had changed. When the call ended, I sat there for a while, my hand resting lightly on the edge of the table. I had imagined this moment differently once. I thought it would feel like relief, or victory, or something sharp enough to mark a clear line between before and after. Instead, it felt still, not empty, not heavy, just still, like something that had been spinning for years had finally stopped, and I was left standing in a space I hadn't known how to occupy before. I stood up and walked to the dresser by the window. For a second, I hesitated, then opened the top drawer and reached toward the back. The necklace was still there, a thin silver chain with a small circular pendant etched with a subtle wave pattern. It wasn't expensive. It had never been about that. My grandmother had given it to me years ago, pressing it into my hand one afternoon and telling me almost casually, "You don't have to be loud to be steady." I had stopped wearing it after she passed. I'm not sure when, only that somewhere along the way, it had become easier to set parts of myself aside than to carry them into rooms that didn't make space for them. I lifted the chain, untangled it slowly, and fastened it around my neck. The metal was cool against my skin, familiar, grounding. Later that evening, I drove out to one of the smaller Hale Harbor facilities, the original one my grandmother had built. It hadn't changed much. The building was modest, the landscaping simple. The front porch still lined with chairs, where residents could sit and watch the day move by. I didn't go inside. I stood near the edge of the parking lot and watched the windows glow as the sun went down. There were people in there who didn't know my name, who didn't know what had happened, who didn't need to. They just needed the place to be what it had always promised to be. For the first time, I felt like that promise had a chance to exist again without being managed into something else. My phone buzzed softly in my pocket. A message from an unknown number. "Thank you. Because of what you did, they're finally listening to us." I read it once, then again. No signature. No explanation. But I didn't need one. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and looked up at the building one last time. This wasn't the ending I thought I wanted. It was better, not because everything was fixed, but because what had been hidden no longer had somewhere to stay. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't standing outside of that truth. I was part of it. I turned back toward my car, the gravel shifting softly under my feet, and let the quiet settle in around me. Not as something to endure, but as something I had chosen and could keep. If this story felt familiar in any way, you're not alone. Share your thoughts or your own experience with standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. And if you want more stories like this about truth, family, and what it takes to heal, stay with me for the next one.